The screen flickered once, and in that single second, everything he built began to fall apart. The room didn't react right away. For a heartbeat, maybe two, the courtroom held its breath as if unsure whether what they were seeing was real or just another procedural delay. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above rows of polished wooden benches, the sound barely noticeable under the tension that pressed down on every person present. Emily Carter stood at the center of it all, 8 months pregnant, one hand resting lightly against her belly, her posture steady in a way that didn't match the storm behind her eyes. She hadn't planned for this moment to begin like this. Not with silence. Not with a screen. 30 minutes earlier, she had been sitting alone on a narrow bench outside courtroom 4B, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the glass panel across the hallway. Her dress was simple, pale blue, the kind that didn't ask for attention, the kind that quietly held its shape even when everything else was falling apart. People had passed her without a second glance. Lawyers in tailored suits, assistants clutching folders, strangers with lives untouched by betrayal. And she had remained still, as if moving might break something she was barely holding together. Inside the courtroom now, that same stillness followed her like a shadow. Across the aisle stood Richard Hale, composed as ever, his charcoal suit perfectly fitted, his expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know him the way Emily once did. He wasn't looking at her. He hadn't looked at her once since stepping into the room. Instead, he leaned slightly toward Vanessa Blake, whose presence seemed to draw the air out of the space with a different kind of gravity. Vanessa's smile was small, controlled, the kind that never reached her eyes but always managed to land exactly where it needed to. Together, they looked like certainty, like a decision already made. The judge adjusted his glasses, glancing briefly at the documents in front of him before lifting his gaze toward the screen that had just come alive without warning. "Counsel," he said, his voice measured, "I don't recall approving any additional exhibits." A man near Emily shifted slightly, his movements calm, almost unremarkable. Daniel Brooks didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "With respect, Your Honor," he replied, "this isn't an addition. It's a clarification." The word hung there. Clarification. Simple, almost harmless, and yet it carried something heavier beneath it. Emily didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift before anyone else did, the subtle fracture in the confidence that had filled the room just moments ago. Richard's jaw tightened, just slightly, a detail most people would miss. Vanessa's fingers, resting on the edge of the table, curled inward for the briefest second, and then the screen brightened. Grainy at first, indistinct shapes. A hallway, a timestamp blinking in the corner. Someone in the back row leaned forward. A whisper moved through the benches like a ripple across still water. Emily closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, just long enough to steady her breathing, just long enough to remind herself that this moment, this exact moment, was the reason she had walked through those doors at all. When she opened them again, she didn't look at the screen. She looked straight ahead, because she already knew what it would show. And for the first time since the case had begun, she wasn't the one waiting to be judged. She was the one who had nothing left to hide. The image sharpened by degrees, the static clearing into something unmistakably real, a corridor lined with neutral walls and soft overhead lighting, the kind found in private office buildings where everything appears calm on the surface, and yet something in the framing felt wrong, slightly off, like a memory that refuses to stay buried. The timestamp in the corner blinked steadily, marking a late evening hour, long after most employees would have gone home, and a figure entered the frame. Hesitant at first, then stepping forward with quiet familiarity, her hand resting gently against the curve of her stomach as she moved with care, as if every step required intention. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom, subtle but growing, as recognition began to take hold, not from names or titles, but from the simple clarity of presence, the kind that does not need explanation. Emily did not turn, did not react, but her fingers pressed just slightly closer against her dress, grounding herself in the present as the past unfolded behind her. Richard shifted in his seat, barely noticeable, a slight adjustment of posture, a tightening of his shoulders that disrupted the perfect stillness he had maintained until now. Vanessa's expression remained composed, but her eyes flickered once, quickly, toward the screen, then back again, as if recalculating something that no longer added up. Daniel Brooks stood with quiet patience, his hands resting lightly at his sides, his gaze fixed not on the judge, not on the opposing counsel, but on the unfolding sequence that required no narration. The figure on the screen paused near a doorway, her reflection briefly visible in the glass panel beside it, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to lean closer, drawn into the frame without moving a single inch. The door opened, slowly, revealing a sliver of light from within, and then voices, indistinct at first, blending into a soft, unstructured hum that suggested conversation but concealed its meaning just long enough to create tension. Someone in the back row exhaled audibly, a small sound that carried farther than intended in the silence. The judge leaned forward, his attention no longer divided between documents and procedure, but fully captured by what was being shown. "Counsel," he began, though the rest of the sentence did not follow, as if even he understood that interrupting now would break something fragile and necessary. The footage continued, steady and unedited, the kind that does not dramatize because it does not need to. And as the audio clarified, the tone shifted, not in volume, but in weight, in the subtle change that occurs when truth begins to surface without permission. Emily's breathing remained even, controlled, each inhale measured, each exhale deliberate, the rhythm of someone who had prepared for this moment not with certainty of outcome, but with acceptance of whatever it might reveal. Richard's gaze finally moved, not toward Emily, but toward the screen, and in that single motion, something changed, something small but irreversible, like a crack forming beneath polished glass. Vanessa's fingers stilled completely now, no longer adjusting, no longer poised, simply resting as if movement itself had become too risky. Daniel took one step forward, not to dominate the space, but to claim it quietly, to anchor the moment as it unfolded. "What you are seeing," he said, his voice calm and precise, "is not interpretation. It is sequence." The word landed differently than expected, not dramatic, not forceful, but definitive in a way that left no room for argument. The courtroom did not erupt, did not react with shock or outrage, but instead settled into a deeper silence, one that carried understanding rather than confusion. Emily remained still, her eyes forward, her posture unchanged, but there was something new in the way she held herself now. Not stronger, not louder, just certain in a way that does not ask to be recognized. And as the footage continued to play, each second measured and undeniable, the balance that had once favored power began, quietly and without announcement, to shift. The audio sharpened next, no longer a distant blur, but clear enough to carry tone, intent, and something far more revealing than words alone. The woman on the screen spoke first, her voice soft, uncertain, asking a question that did not sound like confrontation, but like someone trying to understand what she already feared. And for a brief moment the room seemed to tilt toward that voice, drawn by its restraint rather than its volume. Then another voice answered, lower, controlled, familiar in a way that made several heads in the courtroom turn almost instinctively toward Richard Hale, not because they needed confirmation, but because recognition had already settled in before logic could catch up. Richard did not move this time, not even slightly, but the stillness around him had changed, no longer composed but held together, as if one wrong breath might break it. Vanessa's gaze fixed on the screen now, no longer calculated, no longer measured, but searching for something that was no longer there, control slipping not in a dramatic collapse, but in the quiet absence of certainty. The footage did not rush, did not cut away. It simply continued, allowing the exchange to unfold with a kind of patience that made every second heavier than the last. Emily felt it too, the weight of each passing moment, but she did not turn, did not watch, because she had lived it once already, and living it again was not necessary for her to understand what it meant. Daniel's voice did not interrupt immediately. He allowed the sequence to breathe, to establish itself without interference. And when he finally spoke, it was not to explain, but to direct attention. "Please note the time stamp," he said, calm and precise, and the continuity of the recording. A simple statement, but one that closed the door on any suggestion of manipulation before it could even form. The judge nodded almost imperceptibly, his eyes fixed on the screen, absorbing not just the content, but the implications that followed. A document rustled. Somewhere in the room, quickly stilled, as if even that small sound felt out of place now. On the screen, movement shifted, the angle revealing more of the interior space beyond the doorway, enough to establish context, enough to remove doubt. And with that, the balance that had once seemed immovable began to lean further, not dramatically, not all at once, but with a quiet inevitability that carried more force than any sudden reveal. Richard's hand moved at last, a subtle adjustment near the edge of the table, fingers pressing lightly against the polished surface as if grounding himself in something solid, something unchanged. But the reflection beneath his hand offered no such reassurance, only a distorted echo of a man no longer fully in control of the narrative he had built. Vanessa's posture straightened, almost reflexively, as if reclaiming composure through structure alone, but her silence now was different, no longer strategic, but necessary. Emily's breathing remained steady, her presence unchanged, but there was a shift in the way the room responded to her, not outwardly, not with visible acknowledgement, but in the subtle redirection of attention, the quiet understanding that she was no longer the subject of scrutiny, but the center of truth. Daniel took another small step forward, not to dominate, but to align himself with the moment as it unfolded, his voice steady as he added, "Sequence matters, Your Honor, because sequence establishes intent." And this time the words did not hang. They settled, firmly, into the space between doubt and realization. The courtroom did not erupt, did not react with sudden noise or visible shock, but instead sank deeper into a silence that carried clarity, the kind that does not need to be announced because it is already understood. And as the footage continued, uninterrupted and unchallenged, the shift that had begun moments earlier solidified into something undeniable, something that could not be redirected or dismissed, something that no longer belonged to argument, but to fact. The footage did not pause, did not hesitate. It moved forward with the same quiet certainty, and with each passing second the context grew clearer, not through dramatic revelation, but through accumulation, detail by detail, moment by moment, until what had once been ambiguous became undeniable. The voices on the screen no longer overlapped or blurred. They separated, distinct and measured, revealing not just what was said but how it was said, the tone, the pauses, the choices that carried meaning far beyond the words themselves. Someone near the front shifted in their seat, the faint creak of wood echoing softly, a reminder that this was still a room full of people, even as it felt suspended in something larger than any one of them. Emily remained still, her hand resting where it had been, her posture unchanged, but there was a subtle release in her shoulders now. Not relief, not yet, but the absence of tension that comes when the burden of proof no longer belongs to you. Richard's gaze stayed fixed on the screen, unblinking, as if looking away would confirm something he was not prepared to face. His expression carefully held in place, but the precision of it had begun to fracture, small inconsistencies appearing at the edges, the kind that only become visible when control is no longer absolute. Vanessa inhaled slowly, her composure returning in measured increments. But it was different now, no longer effortless, no longer instinctive, but constructed, deliberate, as if she were rebuilding something that had already started to collapse. Daniel did not rush, did not fill the silence unnecessarily. He allowed the sequence to reach its own conclusion, understanding that interruption would weaken what was already speaking for itself. "Your Honor," he said at last, his voice even. "The relevance here is not isolated to a single statement, but to the consistency of behavior over time." And the phrasing was careful, not accusatory, not dramatic, but precise in a way that left no space for dismissal. The judge leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled for a moment before resting again on the bench, his attention unwavering, his role shifting from passive listener to active evaluator as the implications settled into place. On the screen, the scene advanced further, revealing movement that aligned with the timeline Daniel had referenced, reinforcing not just the content, but the continuity, the sequence that transformed individual moments into a pattern. A quiet murmur moved through the room again, softer this time, less uncertain, more aligned, as if the audience itself had begun to reach the same conclusion without needing to be guided there. Richard's hand withdrew from the table, resting now in his lap, a small change, almost insignificant, and yet it marked a shift from presence to containment, from control to response. Vanessa's eyes lowered briefly, then lifted again, her expression neutral, but the absence of her earlier confidence was unmistakable, replaced by something quieter, something that did not seek attention but could not avoid it. Emily did not move, did not turn, but the space around her had changed. The weight that had once pressed inward now redirected outward, toward the screen, toward the evidence, toward the narrative that no longer required her to defend it. Daniel took one final step forward, aligning himself with the center of the room, not to dominate, but to conclude, his voice steady as he added, "When sequence aligns with evidence, interpretation becomes unnecessary." And this time the words did not linger. They settled, firmly, into the structure of the case. The courtroom remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of recognition, the kind that follows understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud. And as the footage reached its final frame, holding for just a second longer before fading to stillness, the shift that had begun quietly now stood complete, not declared, not announced, but fully realized in the space between what had been claimed and what had been shown. The screen went dark, but the silence it left behind did not lift. It deepened, settling over the courtroom like something final, something that did not need repetition to be understood. No one spoke immediately, not the attorneys, not the judge, not even the observers who had filled the benches expecting a routine proceeding and now found themselves witnessing something far more decisive. Emily remained where she stood, her posture unchanged, but there was a quiet shift in her presence, not louder, not more visible, just anchored in a way that did not require acknowledgement. Richard exhaled slowly, the first visible break in his composure, his gaze lowering for a fraction of a second before returning forward. But the delay was enough, the timing alone enough to register that something had slipped beyond recovery. Vanessa adjusted her position, a small movement of her shoulders, her chin lifting slightly, as if reclaiming control through posture. But the effect did not hold, not in the same way it once had, because the room was no longer responding to presentation, it was responding to proof. Daniel did not rush to fill the moment. He allowed it to exist, to settle fully before adding anything further, understanding that what had just been shown carried more weight in silence than it ever could in argument. The judge cleared his throat quietly, not to interrupt, but to reestablish structure, to bring the room back into the framework of procedure, even as the underlying balance had already shifted. "Counsel," he said, his tone measured, "do you intend to introduce supporting documentation to accompany this sequence?" And the question was formal, expected, but it carried an acknowledgement within it, an understanding that the sequence itself had already altered the direction of the case. Daniel inclined his head slightly, calm, prepared. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. "We have submitted financial records, communication logs, and certified reports that align with the timeline presented," his voice steady, each word placed with precision, not to persuade, but to confirm. A clerk moved quietly along the side, placing folders on the bench, the soft sound of paper against wood echoing faintly in the stillness, each document representing not a new argument, but reinforcement of what had already been seen. Richard's attention shifted toward the materials, his eyes scanning briefly, quickly, as if searching for a gap, a weakness, something that could be used to reassert control. But the speed of the motion betrayed something else, urgency, the kind that does not belong to someone certain of their position. Vanessa remained silent now, her earlier composure replaced by a careful neutrality, her focus directed forward, avoiding both the screen and the documents, as if disengagement might preserve what remained. Emily did not reach for the folders, did not look toward the bench, because she already understood what they contained, and more importantly, she understood that the weight of them no longer rested on her shoulders. Daniel stepped slightly to the side, allowing the materials to speak alongside the footage, his role no longer to introduce, but to frame, The consistency between visual record and documented activity establishes continuity, he added, his tone unchanged. And continuity establishes accountability. And again, the words did not seek reaction. They simply completed the structure that had already been built. The judge reviewed the first pages carefully, his expression neutral, but attentive in a way that signaled more than routine evaluation. His pen moving once, making a note that no one else could see, but everyone seemed to feel. A quiet shift moved through the room, not visible, not audible in any single action, but present in the way. Attention had fully realigned, no longer divided between competing narratives, but centered on a single, cohesive sequence of events. Richard leaned back slightly, his posture no longer forward, no longer engaged in projection, but contained, measured, as if recalculating in real time. Vanessa's gaze lowered once more, then steadied, her silence now complete, not strategic, but necessary. Emily stood as she had from the beginning, her hand resting lightly, her breathing even, but the space around her had transformed entirely, no longer defined by defense, but by resolution. And as the judge closed the first folder and reached for the next, the direction of the room did not need to be announced. It was already clear, already set in motion, carried forward not by argument, but by the quiet, undeniable alignment of truth. The turning of a single page sounded louder than it should have, a soft, controlled motion from the bench that seemed to echo through the entire room, not because of volume, but because of timing. The judge paused there for a moment, eyes scanning the document before him, and in that pause, something shifted again, not in a visible way, not in a dramatic break, but in the quiet recognition that the material in front of him was no longer being evaluated in isolation, it was being connected, aligned, placed into the sequence that had already been established. Emily felt it without looking, the subtle change in rhythm, the way the room breathed differently when the direction was no longer uncertain. Her hand remained steady against her dress, her posture unchanged, but the tension that had once lived in her stillness had been replaced by something else, something quieter, something that did not ask for validation because it no longer needed it. Daniel watched the bench carefully, not anticipating reaction, but observing process, understanding that the outcome would not arrive in a single moment, but through accumulation, through each page, each note, each silent acknowledgement that built upon the last. Richard's gaze moved again, this time more deliberately, tracking the judge's movements rather than the documents themselves, as if searching for a signal, a clue, something that might indicate where control could be regained. But there was nothing to read, no expression offered, no opening provided. Vanessa shifted slightly in her seat, the movement controlled, minimal, but enough to break the rigid stillness she had held, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table before settling again. A small gesture that revealed more than it concealed. The clerk placed another set of documents forward, the sound of paper aligning against the polished surface, carrying a finality that did not need to be stated. Daniel stepped forward just enough to re-enter the frame of attention, not to interrupt, but to guide, his voice measured and calm. "Your Honor, if I may direct your attention to page 12, he said, not raising his tone, not pressing, simply placing the reference where it needed to be. The judge turned the page without hesitation, his eyes moving across the text with a focus that did not waver, and as he read, the silence deepened again, not empty, but full, filled with the weight of connection, the alignment between what had been shown and what was now being confirmed. Emily did not follow the page numbers, did not track the details line by line, because she already knew what they would reveal, and more importantly, she understood that the burden of proving them had shifted away from her entirely. Richard leaned forward once more, but the motion lacked the precision it had held before, no longer calculated, but reactive, his attention divided now between the documents, the judge, and the growing realization that the narrative he had relied on was no longer holding. Vanessa's gaze lowered again, not in defeat, not yet, but in avoidance, the kind that emerges when direct engagement becomes too costly. Daniel remained composed, allowing the structure to complete itself, each piece reinforcing the next, until the need for interpretation dissolved entirely. Consistency across independent Records, he added quietly, eliminates ambiguity. And the statement did not linger. It settled, joining the others in a framework that had already taken shape. The judge closed the folder slowly this time. Not abrupt, not final, but deliberate, his hand resting on top of it for a brief moment before lifting again, his pen making another note, small, precise, and unseen by anyone else in the room. A breath moved through the benches, not a sound, not a reaction, but a collective shift, as if the room itself had reached the same understanding at once. Emily stood as she had from the beginning, unchanged in form, but entirely transformed in position, no longer defined by what had been said about her, but by what had been established beyond question. And as the judge looked up at last, his gaze moving from the documents to the people before him, the outcome was not spoken, not yet, but it was already there, present in the space between evidence and acknowledgement, waiting only for formality to give it a voice. The judge's gaze did not move quickly. It settled, first on the documents, then on the screen, and finally on the people before him, as if aligning each element into a single, coherent understanding. When he spoke, his voice was not raised, not dramatic, but it carried a clarity that cut through the silence with precision. The court recognizes the sequence presented and the supporting documentation as consistent and admissible, and though the words were procedural, their weight shifted the entire room in a way no one could ignore. Emily did not react outwardly, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, but something within her released, not relief in the traditional sense, but the quiet recognition that the truth had finally been acknowledged in a space that demanded evidence above all else. Richard remained still, but the stillness no longer held authority, it held restraint. The kind that comes when response is no longer an option but a necessity deferred. His eyes moved. Once more, briefly, toward Emily, and in that single glance there was no accusation, no control, only the absence of both. Vanessa adjusted her position again, this time slower, her movements deliberate as if choosing each one carefully, her expression neutral but no longer composed in the way it had been, the certainty gone, replaced by calculation that no longer led anywhere. Daniel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the ruling without celebration, without emphasis, because the moment did not require amplification, it required completion. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his tone even, then stepped back, allowing the structure of the case to stand on its own. The clerk moved forward again, organizing the documents with practiced efficiency. The soft alignment of paper, signaling transition rather than conclusion. A faint sound carried from the benches, not quite a whisper, not quite a breath, but something in between, the collective adjustment of expectation as the room recalibrated to a new reality. Emily's hand shifted slightly, not away, not tense, simply repositioned as if acknowledging the passage of time within the moment, her gaze remaining forward, steady, unbroken. The judge continued, his voice measured. "Given the established continuity and corroborated evidence, the court will proceed with determinations accordingly." And though the statement was general, its direction was unmistakable. Richard leaned back, the movement subtle but final, his posture no longer engaged with the process, but separated from it, as if the outcome had moved beyond his reach. Vanessa's gaze lowered once more, then lifted, but this time without the sharpness it once carried. Her focus diffused, her presence diminished not by force, but by absence of position. Daniel remained where he stood, not advancing, not retreating, simply present, his role complete in the quietest sense. Emily did not look at either of them, did not seek acknowledgement, did not claim the moment, because it no longer belonged to confrontation, it belonged to resolution. The judge gathered the documents into a single stack, his movements precise, controlled, signaling closure within the framework of the court even as the implications extended far beyond it. The sound of the gavel followed, firm but not abrupt, marking not an end, but a transition from uncertainty to record. And in that sound, brief and contained, the shift that had begun with a flicker of a screen reached its final form, not through force, not through spectacle, but through the steady, undeniable alignment of truth. The sound of the gavel did not linger, but its effect did, stretching across the room in a way that changed how every movement felt afterward, slower, heavier, as if the air itself had settled into a new arrangement. Chairs shifted quietly as people adjusted, not in reaction, but in transition, the kind that follows when something definitive has already taken place. Emily remained still for a moment longer than necessary, not because she needed to, but because she understood the value of stillness when everything else had finally stopped moving against her. Her hand rested lightly against her belly, a gesture that had begun as protection and now felt like confirmation. Something steady, something real, something untouched by everything that had just unfolded. Daniel stepped closer, not urgently, not with celebration, but with quiet intention, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond her. "It is done," he said simply, and the words did not feel like victory. They felt like closure, the kind that arrives without noise. Emily nodded once, a small motion, controlled, acknowledging not the outcome itself, but the path that had led to it. Across the room, Richard remained seated for a fraction longer than everyone else, his posture unchanged, but the stillness around him now empty, no longer filled with control or expectation, just space, unoccupied and unfamiliar. He rose eventually, the movement measured, almost mechanical, his gaze forward, avoiding the center of the room where everything had shifted. Vanessa followed, her steps precise, her expression composed in form, but absent in presence, as if the version of herself that had once commanded attention had been left behind somewhere between the first frame of the footage and the final word from the bench. Neither of them spoke, not to each other, not to anyone, because there was nothing left to construct, nothing left to defend. The narrative had already moved beyond them. Emily did not look in their direction, not out of avoidance, but because there was no longer a reason to. The need to confront had dissolved the moment the truth had taken its place. She turned instead toward the aisle, her steps slow, deliberate, each one grounded in a certainty that had not been given to her, but earned through endurance. The sound of her heels against the polished floor was soft, steady, a rhythm that did not seek attention but naturally drew it, not because it was loud, but because it was unwavering. The people along the benches watched, not openly, not with curiosity, but with a quiet awareness, the kind that recognizes when a story has reached its natural conclusion without needing explanation. Daniel remained a step behind her, not leading, not guiding, simply present, his role now reduced to witness rather than advocate. The doors at the far end of the courtroom stood closed, tall and unremarkable, and yet they carried a significance that had not existed before, not as barriers, but as thresholds. Emily reached them without hesitation, her hand lifting to the handle with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. And when the doors opened, the light from the hallway beyond spilled in, softer, warmer, different from the sharp brightness of the courtroom. She stepped through without looking back, not because she was forced to, but because there was nothing behind her that required her return. The doors closed gently, the sound quiet, almost unnoticed, but final in a way that did not need to be emphasized. Inside, the room began to reset, papers gathered, voices returning in low tones, structure reasserting itself as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But something had, and everyone who had been present understood it, even if they did not speak it aloud. Outside, Emily paused for a brief moment, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but simply to breathe, to exist in a space that was no longer defined by defense or doubt. And in that pause, there was no triumph, no visible relief, only a quiet, steady presence that spoke more clearly than any declaration ever could. The hallway outside the courtroom felt different, not quieter, not louder, but wider somehow, as if the space itself allowed room for something that had been held too tightly for too long. Emily stood there for a moment, not frozen, not uncertain, simply present, her breath steady, her hand still, resting lightly against her belly, feeling the subtle, familiar movement that reminded her of what had always mattered, even when everything else had tried to take that away. Footsteps passed behind her, distant voices resumed, the world continuing with its usual rhythm, but none of it pulled at her the way it once might have. Daniel stepped beside her again, not speaking immediately, not needing to fill the silence. Because some moments did not require language, they required acknowledgement, and that had already been given. You did not win because of the evidence, he said finally, his voice calm, measured. You won because you stayed when leaving would have been easier. And the words were not dramatic, not meant to impress, but they settled into the space between them with a quiet truth that did not need confirmation. Emily turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes, and for the first time since the beginning of the day, there was something softer in her expression. Not relief, not joy, but recognition. The kind that comes when something difficult has been completed without losing yourself in the process. She nodded once, then looked forward again, because forward was the only direction that made sense now. Outside the building, the air carried a different kind of light, warmer, less precise than the artificial brightness inside, and as she stepped through the final set of doors, the sound behind her faded completely, replaced by the open, steady hum of the world beyond. Cars moved along the street. People walked past without noticing, life continuing in ways that did not depend on what had just happened. And yet for her, everything had shifted. She paused at the top of the steps, looking out, not searching for anything, not expecting anything, just taking in the space in front of her as something that now belonged to her again. There was no crowd waiting, no dramatic moment of recognition, no applause, and that absence felt right, because what had been resolved did not need an audience. Richard and Vanessa would leave through another door, another path, carrying with them whatever remained of what had been undone. But Emily did not think about that, not because it did not matter, but because it no longer defined anything she needed to carry forward. She adjusted her grip on her bag, a small, practical motion, then began to walk, her steps steady, unhurried, each one grounded in a certainty that had not been given to her by the court, but confirmed by it. The city moved around her, indifferent, constant, and for the first time in a long time, that indifference felt like freedom, like space to exist without explanation or defense. She did not look back at the building, not once, because nothing behind her required her attention anymore. And as she continued forward, blending into the rhythm of the street, there was no visible sign of what had been lost or gained, no declaration of victory, only a quiet, steady presence that carried its own weight. Some endings do not arrive with noise or spectacle. They arrive with a door closing softly behind you and the realization that you no longer need to open it again. And in that realization, there is a kind of strength that does not announce itself, but changes everything that comes after.